The sun hung low over the Arizona mountains, painting the jagged ridges in a haze of gold and shadow, each peak looming like a silent sentinel over the parched expanse below. Ethan Coulter moved along the edge of his weathered porch, the wood creaking beneath his boots in rhythm with the whistling wind. His eyes, pale and sharp from years under unrelenting skies, scanned the distant brush, though there was nothing to see beyond the swaying mesquite and the scrub dotted with stubborn cacti. Solitude had become both his shield and his prison, the endless quiet a constant companion that reminded him of failures he could neither forget nor forgive. Each day followed the same rhythm: check the traps, maintain the cabin, brew harsh coffee, and keep the rifle within reach. He had long ago learned that waiting was easier than moving, easier than facing the chaos that had once followed him like a shadow across battlefields and broken lives. And then she appeared, a shape weaving through the haze of dust and dry heat, stumbling into the edge of his world as though dragged by some unseen current. Ethan froze, a pulse quickening somewhere deep beneath his calm exterior. At first she seemed almost unreal, a girl no older than her late teens, her frame covered in torn white fabric that hung in shreds, revealing the dark grime that mottled her skin. Her feet were bare, caked in mud and blood, and her arms bore fresh abrasions that spoke of desperate flight. She moved like a creature from a nightmare, all hesitant steps and shivers, yet determined in her forward momentum. The wind caught her hair, whipping it across a face pale and gaunt, her eyes wide and luminous, brimming with a terror that Ethan recognized from a past he had long tried to bury. She fell at his feet without a sound, the cloth she clutched pressed against her chest as if it were the only anchor keeping her tethered to life. A whisper, fractured and trembling, barely reached his ears. "Please, don't." The words hit him with a weight that no rifle or distance could have matched. Ethan's hand twitched toward the gun at his side, but instinct and something older, softer, rooted him in place. That desperate plea, fragile yet raw, demanded more than a mechanical reaction. He stared down at her, noting the rapid rise and fall of her chest, the way her fingers clutched the rag with a tension born of unimaginable fear. He knew then that the fabric she protected concealed horrors, wounds, burns, symbols, traces of suffering far beyond the comprehension of most men. The thought made his stomach tighten, memories of failures past crawling to the surface, whispering accusations and old guilt. He took a measured breath, forcing his thoughts away from the ghosts of those he could not save. This girl, trembling and silent, depended on him in a way that required action, not hesitation. Slowly, deliberately, he knelt down beside her, eyes steady but soft, voice quiet enough not to startle her. "It's all right. You're safe now." Her gaze darted up, a flicker of suspicion but also a tentative spark of hope. Ethan's hand hovered above the cloth for a moment, waiting, watching, and then he did the only thing he could. With care born of both respect and urgency, he lifted the rag from her chest, draping his own jacket over her shoulders as if it were a shield against both the world and the past she carried. Her frame shivered violently, not from cold, but from the tremors of relief and fear intertwining, and Ethan felt something stir inside him, a dormant resolve to protect, to right a small portion of a world that had long seemed irredeemable. For the first time in years, he let himself feel a flicker of hope, fragile and stubborn, as he hoisted her gently into his arms and carried her toward the cabin. Each step away from the wilderness felt like a step toward redemption, not just for her but for him as well. The mountains loomed above, silent witnesses to this new chapter, and Ethan knew the night would be long, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to confront it. The night settled like a heavy cloak over the Arizona desert, and the mountains swallowed the last remnants of sunlight, leaving the world in bruised purples and deep shadows. The cabin, rough-hewn and weather-beaten, sat alone among scattered junipers and cacti, a small island of human presence in an ocean of wilderness. Inside, the air smelled faintly of smoke and old wood. Ethan set Lila gently on the worn cot against the far wall, his hands lingering on her shoulders for a heartbeat, as though he could transfer some fraction of his own resolve into her fragile form. She didn't speak. She didn't move beyond curling tighter into the jacket draped around her shoulders. Her silence was heavy, almost palpable, and it pressed against him, challenging the calm detachment he had cultivated over years of isolation. Outside, the wind whispered across the ridge, carrying with it the sharp scent of dust and sagebrush, and every sound, every rustle, every creak of the cabin Every distant coyote howl made her flinch. Ethan watched her, aware that the small room, which to him was sanctuary, might feel to her like a cage, a place where she was forced to face herself without the option of fleeing. He busied himself with a small fire in the cast-iron stove, the pop and snap of the burning pine giving the room a heartbeat, a rhythm that seemed to soothe them both, even if only slightly. The flames danced across her wide, haunted eyes, reflecting stories of a past too cruel for words, and Ethan could feel the pull of memory tightening in his chest. The screams he couldn't forget, the promises he had broken, the failures he had carried like stones in his soul. He moved quietly, setting a chipped cup of coffee beside him, its bitter steam curling in the air. His rifle rested across the table, a silent reminder that the world beyond these walls was not kind, and that safety was something he could not guarantee, only fight for. Lila's gaze followed him, alert but not yet trusting. Every motion he made seemed to ripple through her tense frame. When he poured a second cup almost ceremoniously, she flinched as if expecting a slap or a blow, and he realized just how deep her terror ran. Hours passed in uneasy silence. Ethan could feel her assessing him in ways that words could never capture, a litany of small gestures and fleeting glances. Then as midnight approached, the wind shifted, carrying with it a sound that froze him where he sat, the rapid, rhythmic thunder of hooves in the distance. He tensed instantly, eyes narrowing, ears straining. Lila flinched violently, pressing her face into the jacket at her shoulders. "It's okay," he murmured, though he had no idea if it would be, and the words felt hollow even to him. The hoofbeats came closer, deliberate, impatient, a signal that they were being hunted, that the nightmare she had fled was not yet over. Ethan's mind raced. 3 riders at least, judging by the cadence and weight. They weren't local, weren't lost travelers. He had seen this kind before. Men who expected to take without question, to bend a world to their will. His fingers brushed the cold wood of the rifle. He could wait, hope they would pass, but the truth was unavoidable. They would not. A tremor ran through Lila, almost imperceptible, but enough to make him notice. Her bare feet twitched under the fabric of the jacket, and her eyes, wide in the firelight, held a fear so pure and raw it pierced him. He realized something then. She was ready to fight, to survive, but she needed the anchor he could provide. He shifted the stove's embers, letting the fire's glow paint their shadows against the wall. He whispered, not asking but commanding gently, "Stay here. Don't move." Her nod was the faintest, barely a flicker, yet it carried weight. In that small gesture, Ethan understood something crucial. Trust was beginning, tentative and fragile, but real. For her, it was an act of surrender to possibility, not weakness. For him, it was a spark, igniting a resolve that had long lain dormant under years of guilt and solitude. The wind howled through the gaps in the shutters, bringing with it the scent of dust, blood, and something darker, intent. Ethan knew the night would bring a reckoning, a collision of past failures and present danger. But for the first time in years, he felt the pulse of purpose. Not for himself, not entirely, but for her. He settled near the doorway, rifle ready, firelight at his back, eyes fixed on the ridge where the hoofbeats thudded against the earth like a drumbeat of doom. Lila's breath came shallow and fast, yet it was steady enough to remind him she was still there, still fighting. And as the darkness stretched and the shadows gathered, he realized the night was no longer about survival alone. It was about claiming it back, step by step, for both of them. And in that recognition, the tension of fear became something sharper, something alive. The first spark of defiance against the world that had hunted her so mercilessly. The first light of dawn spilled across the desert, thin and silver, brushing the jagged ridges of the mountains with quiet insistence. Inside the cabin, shadows still clung to corners, reluctant to surrender to the day. Ethan Coulter moved with deliberate care, his hand steady despite the restless beat of his heart. Lila remained curled on the cot, the jacket draped over her shoulders like a fragile shield, her eyes tracing every movement he made, searching for signs of threat or betrayal. He could feel her assessing him the way one might scan the horizon before a storm. Every shift of posture, every breath, a measure of safety or danger. She didn't speak at first. Words seemed to frighten her as much as silence did. Ethan understood that. Trauma had a vocabulary of its own, one that didn't rely on sentences. He prepared a weak, bitter coffee, filling 2 chipped mugs and set one beside her without a word. The ritual, the careful placement of the cup, seemed to interest her more than the liquid it contained. Her fingers hovered over it, trembling, before she finally accepted the cup, her eyes flicking up to meet his for a fleeting instant. No gratitude, no plea, only the quiet declaration of survival. Hours passed. The wind carried whispers of the mountains into the cabin, rustling the thin curtains, shaking the wooden walls. Ethan sat across from her, observing her with the patience of a man who had spent years watching life and death play out with merciless impartiality. Gradually, she began to speak in fragments, tiny threads of her past unraveling carefully, cautiously. "They forced me. Clean their boots," she murmured, voice cracking under the weight of memory. "Then my broken nose. Second time, pain." She stopped, each sentence halting, incomplete yet heavy with meaning. Ethan listened, absorbing every fractured word. He didn't push for details, didn't demand explanations she couldn't give. Yet even in these fragments a story emerged. A pattern of cruelty, discipline disguised as labor, terror inflicted like a ritual. Each syllable she spoke painted a picture of a life contorted by violence. Yet beneath it he saw the spark that had refused to die, a will to survive, a determination threaded through even the deepest scars. The moments between her words were sharper than the words themselves. Ethan's senses, long honed to anticipate danger, detected the faint rustle outside, a snap of twig that seemed too deliberate for wildlife. His rifle rested across his knees, fingers brushing the stock, ready to act. Every shadow could harbor menace, every whisper in the wind a harbinger of those who would reclaim her, drag her back into darkness. And then the first real revelation came. She flinched as she unwrapped the jacket slightly, revealing a flash of her back, a jagged tapestry of scars and symbols, some recent, some older, carved into her skin like a map of torment. Ethan's chest tightened. The markings were not random. They were deliberate, coded in pain, each one a message from a cruel mind that had claimed her body as its own. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to look away, though his mind raced with questions: who had done this and why had she survived when others hadn't? She noticed his reaction, though she said nothing. The silence between them was charged, electric with the unspoken acknowledgement of horror and defiance. Lila folded back into herself, curling tighter, trying to shrink, to vanish into the small patch of floor where the morning light didn't reach. Ethan understood that instinct. He had done the same once during a battle that had left him hollow. Yet he also knew that survival demanded presence, demanded action. "Listen to me," he said finally, voice low, measured, each word deliberate. "I'm not leaving. Nothing out there gets you back, not while I'm standing." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a man who had stared into the void and refused to blink. Lila's eyes met his, wider this time, searching for sincerity, for proof that this wasn't just another cruel trick played by fate. Ethan nodded once, firmly letting her know she had a protector. The day stretched on, shadows shifting, the air heavy with both tension and a tentative trust. Lila began to move, tiny gestures at first, shifting her weight, taking sips of water, letting him near without flinching. Each small act was monumental, a testament to resilience shaped under unspeakable torment. Yet the ridge outside remained alive with whispers and possibilities, hoofbeats, voices, men who had left only to return stronger, crueler, determined to reclaim what they considered theirs. By nightfall, Ethan had begun to piece together not just her story but the stakes they faced. This was not a fleeting nightmare. The world outside the cabin was hunting her. And yet within these 4 walls, a fragile alliance had formed. 2 survivors, scarred and haunted, learning to navigate a dangerous world together. And in that delicate equilibrium, Ethan felt the stirrings of something he hadn't allowed himself in years. Hope. A hope threaded through fear, sharpened by vigilance, and strengthened by the raw pulse of survival. The mountains loomed around them like silent sentinels, watching, waiting, and the wind carried the faint promise of confrontation. Yet inside the cabin, between the rhythm of her breath and the warmth of the fire, Ethan realized something profound. Survival was no longer a solitary endeavor. She had chosen him as her anchor, and he had chosen, for the first time in years, not to turn away. The sun had sunk behind the jagged peaks, and the desert lay draped in shadows that seemed heavier than night alone. The wind carried with it the scent of dry earth and something metallic, iron and dust and danger. Ethan Coulter crouched at the edge of the porch, the rifle balanced against his knee, his eyes sweeping the ridgeline. Every muscle in his body tensed, waiting, listening. The cabin was silent, save for the subtle sound of Lila's shallow breathing inside, but he knew the stillness was a prelude, a fragile pause before the storm. Then he heard it, the thud of hooves against the earth. Not distant this time, but deliberate and growing. 3 figures emerged from the ridge like shadows given form. Men, well-built, confident, moving with the certainty of predators who had never known restraint. Their horses' hooves kicked up clouds of dust that glinted in the dying light, and Ethan's gut clenched. He recognized them from the fragments Lila had whispered in the past day. The men who had claimed her, tortured her, tried to break her spirit. They had returned. He lowered his voice as he turned to the cabin. Inside. Now. Lila froze for a heartbeat, then obeyed, moving with the practiced precision of someone who had learned that hesitation could cost life. She slipped behind the doorway, eyes wide and unblinking, tracing every motion of the approaching men. Ethan stepped into the porch, rifle raised but not aimed, an unspoken challenge. The tallest of the intruders dismounted first, spitting on the dust as if the ground itself were owed a debt. His eyes scanned the cabin, settling on Ethan with a cruel recognition. "Move aside, old man," he barked, voice rough and sharp. "She's coming with us." Ethan's grip tightened on the rifle. His jaw clenched. "Not happening," he said quietly. But there was an edge in his tone that made the man pause. It was the stillness before the tempest, the kind of quiet that carried more weight than words or threats ever could. A flick of movement from the other 2 men brought them into view. One of them rested a hand near a holstered sidearm, fingers brushing the leather, a silent promise of violence. Ethan's mind raced, calculating angles, distances, possibilities, any misstep that could cost both their lives. Lila's small form pressed against the wall, hands gripping the jacket, eyes flicking between Ethan and the intruders. She was trembling, but there was a spark there, a steel-threaded ember of defiance. He noticed it, and it strengthened him. The tallest man stepped closer, boots crunching against the gravel. "This is your one chance," he said. "Hand her over, peacefully." Ethan's finger brushed the trigger, not in haste, but in deliberate warning. "Peaceful isn't part of this territory," he said, voice low, steady. He shifted slightly, letting the rifle's barrel rest just enough to signal he was ready, that every breath, every twitch would be met with immediate consequence. The men exchanged glances. The tension was taut enough to slice with a knife. And then something unexpected happened. A rustle from the forest edge drew all attention. A figure emerged from between the pines, sunlight catching a badge glinting against a worn leather vest. Rifle held ready, stance immovable. Abram Hale, Ethan's wartime companion and now sheriff of the region, stepped into view, eyes locking on the intruders with calm precision. "This territory falls under my protection." Abram's voice cut through the evening air. "Old leather and authority in every syllable. She's under official custody now." The tallest man groaned, swore, spat again, but did not reach for his weapon. The other 2 froze, calculating. Uncertainty etched across their features. They knew better than to test a man like Abram Hale, a man whose reputation alone carried the weight of storms past. Slowly, carefully, the 3 intruders backed away, then mounted their horses with a silence heavy with unspoken threats. They would return, Ethan knew, but not tonight. Not with him and Abram standing between them and their prize. Inside the cabin, Lila exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Ethan lowered his rifle, his muscles still tight, mind still alert. He finally let himself study her face, not for signs of threat, but for relief, for survival, for recognition that the nightmare had been held at bay. "If only for now. You're safe," he said softly, the words heavy with everything the night had demanded of him. Patience, vigilance, courage. Lila nodded once, barely perceptible, but enough to tell him she understood. Enough to tell him that despite the scars, despite the terror etched into her body and mind, she had survived another night. And Ethan knew, with a certainty that no weapon, no mountain, no isolation had ever given him, that the real test was only beginning. The men would return, stronger and more ruthless, and the cabin, Or the ridge. The desert itself would become a battlefield not just of survival but of justice, of redemption, and of reclaiming the fragments of lives so brutally fractured. The fire in the stove crackled, small and stubborn against the encroaching dark, and in its glow, the first true bond between the haunted rancher and the girl who had appeared like a ghost was forged. Quiet, defiant, and unbreakable, night draped itself across the desert like a velvet shroud, the mountains receding into dark silhouettes, their jagged peaks sharp against a sky pricked with cold stars. Inside the cabin, firelight flickered across the walls, casting jagged shadows that danced with the rhythm of the flames. Ethan Coulter sat near the stove, rifle within arm's reach, but his attention wasn't on the weapon. It was on her, Lila. She remained huddled on the cot. The jacket he had draped around her shoulders still clutched like a talisman, a lifeline against a world that had proven itself merciless. He had thought he understood the extent of her suffering, pieced together fragments from her whispered confessions, the half-told stories, the tremors that ran through her body when shadows passed too close. But the cloth on her chest, the one she had begged him not to remove, was a line he had hesitated to cross, a boundary she had silently drawn, and yet he knew that to truly help her, to understand the gravity of what she had endured, he had to confront it. Careful, deliberate, he shifted closer, voice low and steady. "I need to see it," he said, not a demand, but a necessity. Her eyes widened in terror, and she shook her head, whispering hoarsely, "Please, don't." Ethan paused, letting the silence stretch between them like a taut wire. He saw the quiver of her lips, the wild flash in her eyes, the instinct to disappear into herself. He could have turned away, left her cocooned in the fabric of fear, but that wasn't what he had come to do. This was no longer about survival alone. It was about acknowledging the full scale of horror she had carried, and bearing witness to it so that she did not bear it in silence. With painstaking care, he eased the cloth from her chest, draping it over the cot like a fragile promise. What lay beneath made his breath catch. Her back was a map of agony, carved and scorched, scarred in a pattern that told stories of ownership, of cruelty so meticulously inflicted it bordered on ritual, symbols etched into flesh, raised and raw, twisted by burns and repeated blows, spiraled across her shoulder blades and down her spine. Each mark carried meaning he could only begin to guess, and yet the horror was not just in the physical evidence, it was in the story written in pain, in the way her body had endured the impossible and refused to surrender entirely. Ethan staggered back instinctively, the rifle forgotten at his side. The firelight trembled across the room, shadows stretching like accusatory fingers. Lila shrank further, curling into herself as if she could vanish entirely into the floorboards. The sight of her scars should have repelled him, terrified him, yet it invoked something far stronger, a raw, aching, protective instinct, a fire of anger and sorrow that surged in his chest. His hands shook, not from fear but from the gravity of the revelation, from the responsibility now cemented on his shoulders. "You're still here," he said, voice low, almost reverent. "You survived it all." Her gaze flicked up, fragile and defiant at once, and for the first time, he saw the ember of resistance that had kept her alive through unthinkable torment. She had not asked for rescue, had not begged for protection beyond the whispered plea for him not to remove the cloth, and yet, in her survival, there was a declaration. She refused to be claimed again. The wind outside picked up, rattling the shutters with a menacing insistence. Ethan's mind, ever vigilant, raced. These marks were not merely symbolic, they were a message. Someone had left her alive for a reason. Someone had claimed her body to mark her as their possession, and yet survival had made her a threat. Whoever had done this would not stop until she was either broken or silent, and they would return. Ethan's hands hovered near the rifle, but it was not the weapon that made him feel alive. It was the choice before him, the choice to act, to fight, to turn the scars into testimony, to transform horror into defiance. He could not undo what had been done, but he could ensure that the men who had left these marks, who had tried to extinguish her spirit, would not claim her again. For the first time, Lila shifted on the cot, unwrapping slightly from the jacket. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She simply allowed the world to acknowledge the reality of her body, her story, her existence. And in that moment, a fragile alliance was cemented, not just of protection but of understanding. He would not flinch from what she carried, and she would not flinch from the reckoning to come. Outside, the desert was silent, but the mountains, sharp and unforgiving, held secrets Ethan knew they would soon reveal. Inside, the cabin breathed with tension, firelight, and the unspoken promise of confrontation. A reckoning was coming, and for the first time in years, both of them would face it together, scarred, defiant, alive. The desert lay shrouded in a near impenetrable black, stars hidden behind a thin veil of clouds, as if the universe itself conspired to keep the horrors of the night concealed. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, flickering and coughing, throwing jagged shadows that quivered against the walls like restless ghosts. Ethan Coulter sat on the edge of the cot, eyes never leaving Lila, who remained still curled beneath the jacket he had placed over her shoulders hours ago. The silence between them was heavy, thick with anticipation, yet different from before. It was no longer just fear, but the quiet before revelation, the pause before truth. Lila's eyes flicked up briefly, meeting his, and Ethan saw something he hadn't noticed before. Not just fear or exhaustion, but a spark of something fierce, something that refused to bend entirely to the cruelty that had carved her body. She whispered, voice raw and uneven, they did it for a reason. Ethan's stomach tightened. He had known the scars were intentional, deliberate, but he hadn't realized the depth of the design. What reason? He asked, keeping his tone steady, controlled. She swallowed hard, the sound harsh in the quiet room. The operation. It's bigger than me. Bigger than anyone they've touched. They mark their survivors. Her words were measured, almost ritualistic, as though naming it aloud gave her power over it, yet also drained her. I'm not just a victim. I carry what they want, secrets, evidence, knowledge, something they believe belongs only to them. Ethan's pulse quickened. His mind raced through the implications, trying to connect fragments she had offered over the past days. The forced labor, the punishment, the mutilation. This was not random cruelty. This was systemic, calculated, organized. A criminal operation that used terror as ownership, fear as a binding agent, and yet Lila had survived. Against all odds, she had carried what they wanted and remained alive. Who are they? He asked, voice barely above a whisper, though every muscle in his body tensed. They run a network, she continued, the words coming slower now, each syllable drenched in fatigue and dread. Mining operations, hidden camps, children, women. Everyone who doesn't comply is broken. Some don't survive. The symbols, my back, they mark ownership, compliance, survival. If you see the patterns, there's a reason behind every cut. A map, a record. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. The intricate carvings he had glimpsed in the firelight were more than scars. They were documentation of horrors, proof of atrocities designed to terrify and control. And somehow, she had carried this knowledge with her, intact. Despite everything. The wind outside shifted sharply, rattling the shutters with urgency, as though the desert itself whispered a warning. Ethan's hands gripped the edge of the cot, knuckles white. They'll come back, he murmured. Soon, and they'll know you're here. Lila nodded, a subtle twitch of her jaw. I've survived before, she said, voice firmer, but this time, I can't do it alone. If they come, I won't just survive. I'll fight. Ethan recognized the resolve in her, the defiance threading through her terror. She had spent her life being hunted, controlled, beaten into submission, yet now, she was asserting something different, agency, power, a promise that her scars were not just evidence of survival, but weapons in their own right. The firelight flickered across her shoulders, across the intricate patterns of pain etched into flesh, and Ethan realized something chilling. The markings were not just a history, they were a map. A guide to the operation itself. Someone who understood them could trace the network, dismantle it, hold the perpetrators accountable. That was why she had been spared. That was why she had been left alive. A sudden noise outside, subtle but precise. The snap of a branch, the shift of dust, made them both freeze. The intruders had been cautious before, but now they were organized, methodical. They would return, prepared, relentless. The night that had begun with revelation now thickened into impending confrontation. Ethan adjusted his grip on the rifle, heart hammering, mind sharpening with the clarity of imminent danger. Lila's hands tightened around the jacket, eyes fierce now, focused, ready. You're not hiding anymore, Ethan said softly, almost to himself. "You're not just surviving." A faint, almost imperceptible nod confirmed it. She would survive, yes, but she would also fight. And together, they would face the nightmare that had hunted her for so long. The cabin, the fire, the mountains, the desert, they were no longer simply shelter. They were the first line of defiance, the last refuge before the storm. And Ethan knew with a cold certainty that made his teeth grit, that when the storm came, nothing would be left unchanged. The night stretched long and heavy, carrying with it the tension of secrets, scars, and an approaching reckoning. Every sound, the wind, the distant howl of a coyote, the subtle crack of the cabin floor, was amplified, each a possible herald of danger. Ethan and Lila sat in the low firelight, two figures bound by survival and shared purpose, aware that the coming confrontation would demand more than courage. It would demand everything they had left to give. The first rays of dawn barely touched the horizon, pale and cold, as if the desert itself were reluctant to witness what was about to unfold. The cabin, weathered and solitary, sat at the edge of the ridge like a defiant monument against the mountain's shadowed expanse. Inside, Ethan Coulter moved with precision born from years of battle and isolation, rifle balanced in his hands, every sinew coiled like a spring. Beside him, Lila crouched low, eyes sharp, muscles taut. Not a frightened girl, but a predator sharpened by terror and survival, carrying scars that now served as maps of knowledge, strategy, and memory. Outside, the desert was alive with motion. Dust clouds rose along the ridge, kicked up by hooves pounding in measured, terrifying unison. Three riders, armored in arrogance and cruelty, approached with the confidence of men who had never faced defeat. Their eyes were cold, calculating. They had come not just for her body, but for the secrets etched into it, for the knowledge she carried that could unravel their operations. Their arrival was silent, measured, predatory. But Ethan was ready. He signaled to Lila with a subtle tilt of his head. She understood instantly. No words, no hesitation. Two lives, scarred and haunted, now moving in perfect synchronization, a silent accord forged from fire, fear, and trust. The first man stepped forward, spitting into the dirt, eyes scanning the cabin. "This ends now," he called, voice harsh, cruel. "You can hand her over, or—" Ethan's finger hovered on the trigger. His voice was calm, measured, yet filled with lethal weight. "Or you'll leave empty-handed. Your choice." The man laughed, a short, bitter sound, and made a move toward Lila. In a heartbeat, Ethan's rifle cracked, a warning shot, precise, echoing through the canyon. The man froze, eyes wide, hands instinctively raising, but Ethan didn't lower his weapon. Every breath, every flicker of movement outside was monitored, calculated, anticipated, and then they advanced. The other two men spread out, horses straining, hooves tearing into dirt. Ethan's pulse aligned with the rhythm of survival. Past training, battlefield instincts, and raw instinct fused into one. He fired again, not to kill immediately, but to control, to dictate the terms of engagement. Lila, moving beside him, was a shadow, darting, agile, using the cabin and surrounding rocks for cover, her own movements silent but lethal in precision. The first rider tried to circle to flank, unaware of the layout Ethan had memorized, the subtle inclines, the small ridges and shadows he could exploit. A well-placed shot tore through the tension, striking the ground near the horse's legs and sending the rider stumbling. Control lost. Dust and chaos erupted across the ridge, but Ethan and Lila moved with fluid coordination, a dance of anticipation and survival. Hours seemed to condense into minutes. The intruders, arrogant and methodical, began to falter against two defenders who knew the terrain intimately, and whose resolve could not be shaken. Every movement Lila made was a testament to her transformation, from prey to predator, from scarred survivor to agent of reckoning. The scars on her back, once a map of torment, now guided her, each mark a reminder, each line a strategy she had internalized. The tallest man, the one who had first confronted them days before, faltered last. He had underestimated both Ethan's cunning and Lila's resilience. As he reached for his weapon, Lila's hand shot out from cover, a flash of movement he couldn't anticipate. The rifle in Ethan's hands roared in tandem with a swift, precise strike from Lila, and the man collapsed, stunned, defeated by the very pair he had meant to terrorize. Silence descended abruptly, the desert holding its breath. The remaining men fled, chaos and dust marking their retreat. Ethan lowered his rifle, muscles trembling not from exhaustion but from the intensity of the battle, the weight of responsibility, and the adrenaline of survival. Lila's chest rose and fell in deep, even breaths. She stood, shoulders squared, eyes fierce, and for the first time, she looked at Ethan not as a protector but as an equal, a partner in the reclamation of life that had been stolen from her. The fire in the cabin crackled, small and stubborn, mirroring the embers of resolve that now glowed in both of them. Ethan studied her, the transformation complete. Terror had given way to defiance, silence to strategic thought, fear to agency. She had survived, yes, but she had also fought, reclaimed her body, her story, and a fragment of the world that had tried to erase her. Ethan exhaled slowly, letting the rifle rest by his side. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel not just relief, but purpose fulfilled. They had survived the night, the intruders, and the shadows of past failures that had haunted him. And outside, the desert stretched endlessly, indifferent yet somehow welcoming, as if acknowledging their triumph. In the quiet that followed, Lila produced a small, carefully folded piece of paper from the jacket she had carried everywhere, a map of the hidden operation, its codes and locations painstakingly memorized. She handed it to Ethan. No words were needed. Together they had turned survival into strategy, fear into defiance, and scars into weapons. The mountains loomed silent and vast, shadows receding as the first true light of morning touched the desert floor. And inside the cabin, two figures, haunted, scarred, but unbroken, sat together, ready to face the world they had reclaimed. Their story was far from over, but for the first time they faced it on their own terms, unflinching, unbroken, and alive.